Good morning. Colleagues, we are starting our press conference on the outcomes of foreign policy of the year 2025. There is interpretation into 3 languages, English, French, Spanish. There is live broadcast. Over to the Minister. Thank you. Distinguished colleagues, good morning. We're glad to welcome you at this traditional press conference, which we are holding to take stock of each preceding year, especially given the fact that 2025 was so packed with events. I think it's going to be interesting to talk about that. But even the first 20 days of 2026, well, that beats the year 2025, and I think we'll have a chance to talk in detail about these first 20 days. But first and foremost, Happy New Year and Merry Christmas. And from the bottom of my heart, I would like to wish you good luck and success in your professional capacity and in your personal life. I'll try to be as succinct as possible in my opening remarks. Just recently, at the big press conference on December the 19th, President Vladimir Putin of Russia spoke in great detail on the foreign policy, but certainly he also spoke about internal politics. And 5 days ago, on January the 15th, at the Kremlin, he spoke on international affairs as well during a big event. I have already spoken about how turbulent the beginning of this year has been. We have borne witness to unprecedented events, to a gross armed incursion of the U.S. in Venezuela with dozens of injured and dead, with the capture and extraction from the country of the legitimate president Nicolas Maduro, together with his spouse. Accompanied by that, we see threats against Cuba as well as other countries of the Caribbean as well as of Latin America, and we're certainly deeply concerned by the overt attempts of external forces to destabilize the internal political situation in Iran. Kaya Kallas, a personality of modern days, has recently declared that she supports protests, and the international community, probably in the form of the EU, is seeking an overthrow of the regime. I'm not even talking about the aspirations of Western countries to continue using the Kiev regime with a view to dealing a strategic defeat against Russia. Well, this rhetoric has already gone down somewhat, but it still probably remains in the heads of European leaders. Suffice it to remember what Chancellor Merz has said, saying that Germany has to become once again the strongest country in Europe. He has also said that Russia should not be given a chance to get what it wants in Ukraine, because that would be tantamount to appeasement of Hitler. What do you make of that? Not many people have paid attention to his words, but they should have. We very much remember, and we shouldn't forget, what such conceit brought about for the German leadership several times throughout history. Getting back to the Second World War, well, for certain reasons, we can't help remembering the Second World War. And speaking about that, we take note of the fact that there is a resurgence of rhetoric in Japan. They're not just talking about increasing their offensive armed potential, they're also talking about revisiting the non-nuclear status of this country. And they're basically overtly speaking about that right now. Certainly, we are witnessing profound tectonic shifts in the world order itself. It is illustrative that for the last decade, the West has been actively opposing the international law in its original principled form, its own concept of a rules-based world order. And it is quite telling that right now this term, the rules-based order, has basically fallen out of circulation, and all countries, in particular Western countries, are trying to understand what is currently happening in the world in the context of the policy announced by President Trump, the policy he's pursuing actively, and which is probably in accordance with a rules-based order, but it's not the collective West that is writing the rules, but just one representative of this West. And it creates shocks for Europe, and we are following that. It is clear that what's happening and the acts announced by President Trump are an illustration of the competition. On many occasions, we have spoken about the recent trends in the world economic development, namely the People's Republic of China resorting to the very rules that were devised by the West for the globalization model, has managed to overplay its rivals in trade, in economics, in infrastructure projects. The financial, the economic indicators of China's development are testimony to that. We are also seeing that this situation, they're trying to counter that using sanctions, using duties. Yes, of course, the U.S. seeks a compromise, but so far, all of that is happening in the absence of any kind of common criteria, which before long had underlined the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank. Well, it would seem that the world order the West is happy with should be based on these rules, but these rules have been basically struck out right now. It's the law of the strongest, and we are all witnessing that. We'll speak in greater detail about what's going on in the world, and I think we'll have an interactive dialogue on that. But of course, not just countries of the global south, of the global east, are suffering the consequences of these developments. Please do not wave the hand because it's very distracting. But yeah, even within the Western society itself, there are crisis trends piling up. Greenland is an evident example of that. Everyone is talking about that. And around Greenland, there is an ongoing discussion. And one could have hardly imagined anything like that some time ago. Right now, there are talks about the prospects of keeping NATO as a single Western political and military bloc. Speaking about Greenland, we believe that if the Western countries want to deal this way with Greenland, but as for us, in all our dealings with the global majority, with the global south, with everyone who is interested in talking to Russia, in talking about mutually beneficial projects, we'll speak with these countries based on such principles as equality. We would like to use ubiquitously the general norms of international law, but the most important principles include equality, mutual respect, as well as a quest for a balance of interests. These are indefeasible principles that are applied to international affairs, whatever you call that, international law, or if you dub it any other name. These principles of equality cannot simply be unmade. Well, of course, those who've got more resources will have greater influence on the outcome, but that said, we still need to search for an outcome which will represent a balance of interests. Russia is going to consistently defend its interests without encroaching upon anyone else's legitimate rights, but meanwhile preventing anyone else from encroaching on ours. We've got our strategy for foreign policy that has been endorsed in March 2023 by President Putin, and this strategy states the need to protect our rights, creating a favorable external environment for Russia's internal development. And of course, there's another thing of the utmost importance, namely our further actions with a view to strengthening our national sovereignty. I would also like to say that in this context of strengthening our national sovereignty, we have a huge help in the form of amendments that were made to the Russian Constitution in 2020. As I said, we are willing to work with everyone who reciprocates, who is disposed to seek an honest dialogue without blackmail, without pressure, without any of that. And everyone knows that very well. Now, speaking about the rhetoric used by the West against Russia last year, I can tell you that this notorious isolation of Russia, and this is no secret, has never happened, however much it was spoken about by our ill-wishers. The biggest events include the celebrations of the anniversary of the victory in the Second World War, the parade in Red Square, a great number of foreign guests, and we are deeply appreciative to everyone who has personally attended these solemn events or who have dispatched a special delegation to attend those events. And speaking about the Second World War and its outcomes, I would be remiss if I did not mention the similar event that took place in Beijing on September the 3rd to celebrate the defeat of the militarist Japan and the end of the Second World War. These two events have been a brilliant illustration of the fact that the overwhelming majority of countries are not willing to forget either the history or the lessons of the Second World War. And this is a very important conclusion that we can draw from the outcomes of last year. As for our relations with concrete countries or concrete regions, I'm not going to dwell on that right now because we'll have a chance to talk about that during the Q&A session. But honestly, concrete detailed information on our relations with the regions and countries. That is something you can find in our annual report, which cites the statistics, which cites all the facts. So if you're interested in concrete countries, I hope you have had a chance to get acquainted with that document. But speaking about previous year and its outcomes, I would like to mention something that has an increasing importance in 2026. First and foremost, I refer to our policy of building a belt of good neighborliness and cooperation in post-Soviet countries, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Eurasian Economic Union. And we will keep promoting these flagship initiatives that were put forth by President Putin. First and foremost, I refer to the establishment of a Greater Eurasian Partnership, and based on this material foundation, we'll try to build a continental architecture of equal and indivisible security. Incidentally, together with our Belarusian friends, we are promoting an initiative aimed at elaborating a Eurasian Charter of Multipolarity for the 21st century. This charter has been announced as open for participation to all countries of the Eurasian continent without exception. I spoke about our relations with China. These relations are unprecedented in terms of their depth, of their level, in terms of how much our positions coincide on the developments in Eurasia as well as across the world arena. I would also like to note the special and privileged nature of our partnership with India. India is another country that President Putin has paid a visit to in December last year. And our efforts to strengthen security in Eurasia have been translated into a treaty on comprehensive cooperation with North Korea, with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that has provided us with internal help in liberating Kursk region from Ukrainian militants. I've spoken about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well as BRICS.
All BRICS countries are our good partners, and with each and one of them, we have strengthened our relations throughout the past year. We have strengthened the foundation for further development of our cooperation in all spheres. Right now, we are preparing a third meeting at the highest level between Russia and Africa. An important event in the run-up to the preparation to that event was the second ministerial conference between foreign ministers of Russia and the African Union countries. It was held last month in Cairo. Speaking about multilateral diplomacy, naturally would like to highlight the task to strengthen BRICS, and amid mounting interest towards that association, will be helping in any way possible the Brazilian chairmanship. Well, that was happening last year. Our Brazilian friends suggested many new initiatives and followed up on many projects that we have launched back at the Kazan summit, BRICS summit in 2024. Following our initiative, which was supported by the group of friends of countries in the support of the UN Charter, we've adopted two principled decisions about creating a special day of fight against neocolonials. It would be celebrated on the 14th of December every year, as well as declaring an international day to counter unilateral sanctions. This day will be celebrated annually on the 4th of December. Upon our initiative, in the fall of last year, in Hanoi, a UN convention was signed. It was a UN convention to counter cybercrime. This was the first document in that sphere aimed at ensuring international information security. We hope that the same specific results would be reached during the unfolding discussions about how to regulate the artificial intelligence. I'll be prepared to speak on all aspects of Ukrainian crisis, but I can mention, as was said multiple times by President Putin, we are committed to finding a political and diplomatic solution to the Ukrainian crisis. If we take a look at the history and background of that crisis, starting with 2014, especially starting with 2022, it was never a lack of goodwill on the part of the Russian Federation in terms of reaching political settlement. However, each and every time, our Western neighbors, primarily European, did everything to torpedo those agreements. They're behaving the same way right now. In regard to the initiative promoted by the Donald Trump administration, trying to convince the U.S. administration not to find an agreement with the Russian Federation. If you read up on the statements by the European politicians, leaders, and Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen, Macron, Starman, Rutte, everyone, they're seriously preparing for the war with the Russian Federation. They're not hiding that fact. Our position on the Ukraine, to put it in a nutshell, is that there is a need to eliminate the primary causes of that crisis, the primary root causes that the West has been creating for many years in order to turn the Ukraine into a security threat against our country, trying to create a stronghold against Russia right at our border. And they were encouraging purely Nazi regime, which came to power as a result of coup d'etat in 2014. a regime that has made its policy to eliminate by law and by everything, elimination of everything Russian: media, education, and canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. We have an interest in facilitating the decrease of tension in all spheres that I've mentioned before, be that Venezuela, and I'd like to especially highlight the Iranian situation that needs to be settled by respecting Tehran's right for peaceful use of nuclear energy. We're also convinced that in order to find a long-term resolution for the situation in the Middle East, we need to finally create the Palestinian state, executing the UN resolution, and we think that this is still very relevant also in the light of the well-known initiative of President Trump on the creation of the Board of Peace. I think I'll finish my introductory remarks at this, and I'm prepared to take questions. Yes, please, RIA Novosti. Thank you very much. Good morning, Ms. Minister. I'm here. I'm right over here. Cristina Rodriguez, RIA Novosti. I'd like to ask a question that has to do with something that you've already mentioned. The events of the past week in the world are showing us that the very notion of the international law is being destroyed. Hence the question, does the international law work? Can we follow it? Or the principle each for himself is in place? How is the initiative on Eurasian security by President Putin is being implemented? And yet another question. The Russian representatives are talking about the need to resuscitate the OSCE. Is this relevant, considering that the Eurasian security notion? And so a lot of questions here. As for the world order and the international law and everything that has to do with that, everything regarding the notions that have been promoted and come into action by some countries that runs counter to our understanding of the international law. I have said that for many years the UN Charter remained a universal recognized criteria for actions in all spheres for all countries. When the Charter was violated, everyone was prepared to discuss the violation or the accusation of a violation within the United Nations Security Council. We've seen heated debates there, but no one doubted this is the central place for the discussion on peace and international security. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a time when the classic use of the international law as the foundation for multilateral relations was substituted by something that is commonly known as a unipolar world, when the United States were leading the Western Bloc, including NATO, essentially decided that the end of history has come, as was declared by Francis Fukuyama in his famous book. They were thinking that no one would stand in the way of Western dominations with all of its theories, liberal, non-liberal, conservative, and so on. So the West was dominating in the world sphere, according to them. When President Putin came to power in the Russian Federation as the outcome of the election in 2000, the situation started to change. Rather, the situation was shifting towards the revision of this very unambiguous Western approach to the world order. And Russia, in the aughts, with President Putin, started to become aware of its place in the world arena. It started to bring back its identity and started to restore it with the full respect of its 1,000 years of history, traditions, principles, friends. With that, the West was starting to think these are just words that will talk, but it will die down. So the West did not even respond to the Munich speech by President Putin in 2007. And many serious politicians, are now regretting that. They are regretting that they did not listen to it, did not think of it as of something more than just words, just rhetoric. Our new foreign policy concept states that we are a civilization nation, will not abandon our roots. We don't have a right to do that. And we keep in line with the traditions left to us by our forefathers. You've mentioned Eurasian security. Interestingly, Eurasia is the largest continent of the world, unlike Africa and Latin America does not have a continental organization that would encompass the entire continent. There are many sub-regional institutions, ASEAN, OSCE that you've mentioned, some CSTO, CIS, post-Soviet Union space, Eurasian Economic Union, including the SCO, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and many others. But there is no one encompassing organization. However, Eurasia, as I have already said, is not just the largest continent, it's also a continent which is home to a number of great civilizations, including the civilization represented today by Russia. There is also the Chinese civilization, Arabian civilization, Indian civilization. Possibly that's one of the reasons why it is so difficult to bring all of these trends under one common roof. However, we are convinced that there is no need to set examples and to create a formal bureaucratic structure. It would be quite enough, as a first step, to start an all-continental dialogue so that the countries living in one tremendous space on the face of the earth could reap geopolitical and economic benefits from this situational closeness, proximity. That would ensure an equal dialogue between all countries, and I have said this is the purpose of the Russian-Belarus initiative, not only the countries situated on the continent, however, with the sub-regional organizations as well that have been formed here. We are already promoting closer cooperation between them in terms of political context and in terms of harmonization of some projects, primarily in economic, trade, and infrastructural sphere, and, well, payment as well. The context enshrined in specific documents between Eurasian Economic Union, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and ASEAN are aimed at precisely the creation of something that was outlined by the President as a Greater Eurasian Partnership, which is the foundation for future Eurasian security architecture. Going back to the global trends, I can say that after the Russian Federation started to consistently and without any aggression started to explain what its rights are and started to try to get the recognition of its rightful place in the international institutions, this process became tangible in its results. And the first who paid attention to that was our great predecessor, Yevgeny Primakov. In 1998, he said that step by step, a multipolar world order is taking shape. That coincided with his initiative to start cooperation within the triangle of Russia, India, and China, RIC. It still exists. It hasn't gathered for some time, but no one abandoned that format. We will bring back this association. That became the forerunner of BRICS. It turned into BRICS after Brazil and South Africa joined that association, and now everyone knows this association very well. It has more than doubled in the number of its participants and has a number of dialogue partners as well. When multipolarity as the main trade started to become mainstream, well, you probably remember that point in time. Many political scientists and journalists were saying that nothing good will come of it because that would be equal to the reign of chaos in international affairs. Allegedly, when the bipolar world existed, it was the United States and the Soviet Union. It was very clear. Periphery conflicts were happening somewhere, yes. However, the core of bipolar world was not touched by these conflicts. The unipolar world was also very clear to everyone after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Everyone should just keep quiet and listen to the one. For some time, the new bipolar order was sort of a notion, Chimerica, China and America. Indeed, these are the largest economies, two largest economies right now. However, what will happen in the future in terms of strengthening of positions of each country in the future, well, we'll see. We're advocating for a well-structured process, and we would like it to be based on negotiations and finding a balance of interests. Is it justified that the multipolar world was professed to be a chaos? If we look at the current picture, possibly we can find many advocates of this evaluation. However, it's an evolving process. It's in flux. And I think that these heterogeneous actions by the United States primarily, and the issues that are happening between the United States and Europe right now, the issues that exist between the U.S. and a great number of countries in the world due to tariffs, duties and sanctions, and other actions that reflect the exacerbated competition and unscrupulous competition on the global markets. Well, all of these processes are indeed taking place, and I think they will take time, and quite some time. However, the multipolar trend will not disappear. It cannot be put back into the framework of bipolar or unipolar world. There are many points of growth. I mentioned China, India, Brazil, Africa is going through a second renaissance. Now they're seeing that the economic independence did not come together with the political independence, and that Africa is being still exploited by neo-colonial methods, and former capitals that gave political independence to the countries are still living at their expense. Now this awareness is coming to the African continent, and we feel that daily from our multiple contacts with the African countries. The centers of growth reflect the objective historical process of economic development, of infrastructural development, the use of natural resources, and many other. At some point, we'll still have to agree how these new large, be that national or regional players, as part of integrational associations, how do they interact with each other? And right now, what's on the agenda? We see many turbulent events in terms of strengthening multipolar order. Well, on the agenda is the dialogue. And how do we put this multipolarity into order? It will take a lot of time, and many are saying, and I know what they're saying, maybe it will be an entire era. However, this is an unavoidable process. It's being perceived, and main players are being aware of that. That is also confirmed by the initiative of Donald Trump of the creation of the Board of Peace. We've just received specific proposals and the draft charter of this institution. This initiative reflects the understanding by the United States that even they, with their foreign policy and their philosophy in foreign policy believe it necessary to gather a group of countries that would cooperate on certain issues. Some may contradict me in saying that the Board of Peace was announced in such a way that everyone should bow to the United States. Well, that's a situation that right now Washington would like to see, I guess, but I'd like to assure you that the Donald Trump administration, disregarding all of the actions that have been widely discussed in the world, they are pragmaticists.
And it will realize the need not just to bring together a great number of countries under its umbrella, but also to take into account their legitimate interests in full. Let me highlight such a position, the readiness and the need to take into account the interests of partners is fully reflected in the approaches of Donald Trump administration when it comes to the Ukrainian settlement. That is the only Western country that is ready to address the task of eradicating the root causes of this conflict. In many ways, they were created by the predecessor of Donald Trump, by Joe Biden and his administration. Hence, this is just the beginning of this process. It will be challenging. It would require mobilizing all the resources of all the growth hubs that I was talking about. But if there is the goodwill, and we see signs that such a goodwill will still persist, we'll have success. When it comes to the OSCE, you said that somebody called to resuscitate it, revive it. Well, I do not know whether it is possible to revive it. The OSCE has hit such a rock bottom that there's nothing else to do. The organization that was established upon the principles of equality and consensus has turned completely into a tool that the West, using its majority, has been turning against the Russian Federation on a daily basis. And our stance on the OSCE boils down to the fact that we continue our participation there, but not because we harbor some illusions or hopes. In the current context, all hopes are illusions, but simply because we want to support those OSCE member states that still have common sense. There are quite a number of these countries. Besides our colleagues within the CIS, I'm talking about Hungary, Slovakia, and in a host of other Western countries, we see such sane forces. Therefore, we will keep on maintaining contacts with them and keep the OSCE from burying itself. There are hopes with regard to the current Secretary General, the representative of Turkey, Mr. Sergey Lavrov. He's a seasoned diplomat and he understands the disastrous state of the organization and the state that he inherited. I do not know whether it will have place in the future entities of the Eurasian Security and Greater Eurasian Partnership. I'm not sure about that, because the OSCE is a Euro-Atlantic entity. When it was established, the Soviet Union wanted its members and participants to be countries located to the west of the Eurasian continent. But these very countries of the current collective West insisted that the US and Canada should also participate, and it turned out to be a Euro-Atlantic entity upon the example of the North Atlantic Alliance. NATO and the OSCE are Euro-Atlantic entities, and they feel a dire crisis of NATO. Currently, there are discussions ongoing within NATO whether it's time to shut it down because one NATO member intends to attack another NATO member, but that's a different story. But getting back to your question, I would like to highlight that the Euro-Atlantic concept of ensuring security has discredited itself, and that is why we're talking about Eurasian security. You cannot take it as a given that there is some kind of a European entity, be it NATO, the OSCE, or the European Union. Incidentally, the European Union is part of a Euro-Atlantic concept because its latest arrangements with NATO have completely eliminated the independence of the EU. Although they once again try to revive it, they make calls to create a security system without the United States, allegedly within Europe. They say that they need to fit organically Ukraine into this entity. There are ongoing discussions to create some kind of a construct against the Russian Federation. This mindset underpins the position of the majority of the OSCE member states, Western member states, and this mindset is nefarious. It will lead to no good. I'm talking about the West and the OSCE. I can talk a lot about this matter. I tried to set the tone to our discussion. Probably it would be easier to ask questions. Political Serbian newspaper. Please take a seat. Thank you for this chance to ask a question. Željko Šajn, political newspaper from Serbia. Mr. Minister, yesterday, could you please speak up? The Hungarian company MOL and Gazprom Russian company signed an agreement, signed a contract, and the Serbian company NIS will be owned by MOL. If we take a look at this geopolitical issue, you are an experienced minister. You've been here for 20 years. Well, just about that. Could you please tell me what is the geopolitical issue with that? Does this mean that Russia will not be in the Balkans because Hungary is part of NATO and the EU, and on the other hand, the US needs to give a green light to this selling? And let us take a look at the new security architecture. Will be there a balance between Russia and the US in the Balkans? Thank you. Thanks a lot. When it comes to the oil industry of Serbia, if this arrangement that was announced yesterday was not beneficial to the Russian side, including Gazprom, it wouldn't have been made. It is crystal clear for everyone. And the arrangement in the situation that is ongoing in Serbia is mutually beneficial. And by the way, it was stated by President Vučić when he came to Davos and when he was asked about that. Broadly speaking, you ask whether there might be some kind of forms of cooperation between Russia and the US in the Balkans. We're open for cooperation with everyone. And in this regard, let me remind you that the EU, that Serbia seeks to be part of for many years, namely Federica Mogherini, when she was a top EU diplomat, the EU claimed, with regard to the Balkans, when the EU deals with something, nobody has anything to do with that in this region. They were implying that Russia was not ready to help its Balkan colleagues to help resolve some issues. So in a broader context, talking about Serbia and its interests, I wouldn't just talk about the ways Russia and the US could cooperate in the Balkans, but also the attitude of Serbia for the EU. It was repeatedly stated that the Serbian future is within the EU, but the EU has repeatedly stated, well, we'll see. First, you need to recognize Kosovo's independence. You need to humiliate yourselves first. And second of all, join all foreign policy actions of the EU, including sanctions against the Russian Federation. Is it a decent thing to do for Brussels? Brussels keeps on living, following this mindset and philosophy that it outlined prior to the Ukrainian crisis. Before the first Maidan in 2004, Brussels stated the Ukrainian people must make a choice. He's either with Russia or with the EU. And this friend of all mindset is a guarantee that the EU will end up badly. I do hope that our Serbian friends completely realize where they are being dragged into and what price they need to pay, and how they intend to increase their clout in the Balkans. We have more opportunities with the US in the Balkans to contact more in terms of Bosnia and Herzegovina and other countries of the region. We do have such contacts. So far, they haven't led to any positive or specific results. However, we are open for such contacts, and by the looks of it, the American colleagues are ready to develop them as well. Ukraine.ru. Over to you. Use the mic, please. Mr. Minister, Madam Zakharova, hello. Anna Cherkas, Ukraine.ru. Thank you for this opportunity. I have two questions. The first one, what is the format that the Russian Foreign Ministry intends to use to build further contacts with the US, including to bring relations back to normal? And the second question, Moscow claimed that US President Donald Trump decided to liberate two Russian citizens that were part of the Marinero crew. Were they released? Were they set free? Have they come back home? Where are they now? And overall, Minister, in your view, the seizing of a Russian flagged tanker by the US troops, had it a negative impact on future prospects between Russia and the US? Thank you for your question. The first part of the question was about the interaction between Russia and the US. Yes, the format that the Russian Foreign Ministry intends to use to cooperate with the US is not just we're planning to interact, we're already interacting. Unlike Biden administration, the Trump administration immediately expressed their interest in overcoming this abnormal situation when the embassies of our countries in Washington and in Moscow, respectively, could not function and operate normally. From the very beginning of last year, we have established contacts and we have shaped a dialogue mechanism on the work of the embassies. However, at the very beginning, we outlined the need, and that is something that was supported by Washington, by the Trump administration, not to be just confined to issues of visas, who got visas, how the security services are working within the embassies, and purely consular issues, how diplomats are moving in the host country. What we proposed is to reach an agreement on the key issue that has to do with diplomatic relations, namely the issue of Russian diplomatic property. The Obama administration, 2 weeks prior to its departure from the White House, arrested this property, and it is being kept, and it was kept by the previous administrations, including, regrettably, the Donald Trump administration. Let me remind you that in late December 2015, Obama all of a sudden announced that he seizes 5 diplomatic properties. Our ambassador, then Ambassador Sergey Kislyak, got a call from Mr. Flynn. He was a part of the Donald Trump team and he intended to be part of the administration, and he asked our ambassador not to respond to this completely counterproductive and illegitimate gesture by Obama. And he said that in 3 weeks' time there will be the inauguration of Donald Trump in January 2016, and we will improve everything. And please do not make a harsh response to that. And we heeded to this advice and we postponed our response. Regrettably, the Trump team failed to rectify this injustice. This is a flagrant violation of all diplomatic conventions. And then we explained to our colleagues in Washington that we had to respond. And since then, the situation has persisted. We would ensure that we start talking about this matter. Up until now, unlike the understanding that was reached, the American colleagues do not want to talk about that. In order to have normal operation of diplomatic missions and in order to have some contacts, and Washington speaks in favor of expanding these contacts under Donald Trump. For this to happen, we need to have direct air flights, and that is something that we include in our agenda of negotiations. Talking about other tracks of our interaction with the U.S., it also includes Ukraine, naturally, and we value that under Trump, the U.S. became the only country that not only expressed the understanding and taking into account the interests of the Russian side, but also came up with the solutions. They took into account the root causes of the current crisis. We welcome such an approach, and we believe that it is completely justified in Alaska, in Anchorage on the 15th of August last year, and President Putin has repeatedly stated it publicly. We welcomed the proposals that were submitted by Washington prior to the meeting in Alaska. And we do hope up until now that this understanding is still in place, although we see that Europe and Zelensky with his team in a hysterical way try to confuse the US and try to make them change tack, try to impose their concepts, including primarily the 60-day truce or eternal truce. It is clear that the Ukrainian side is in a very bad situation on the battlefront line. And not only that, politicians in the corruption scandals have mired other processes. But allowing to rearm the Kiev regime once again and giving him a chance to have a respite and to attack once again the Russian Federation as a tool of frenzy Western Europeans. Well, we cannot allow ourselves to have this luxury. In Davos, some kind of meetings are scheduled for tomorrow, and they will try to persuade Donald Trump to take approaches that have completely failed and discredited themselves over the past years. But the focal point here is that when Europe talks about settling the Ukrainian crisis, they say we need to put an end to war as soon as possible, and at the same time we need to agree on the security guarantees for Ukraine. Well, for what little remains of Ukraine. What does it mean? It means that since the Americans are not incredible, as Europeans believe, and Greenland case proved its point, we need to establish the security system without the US, but with Ukraine, and the security guarantees that are proclaimed with such a pride by European colleagues as they promote their contribution in ensuring peace. These guarantees are provided for the current Kiev Nazi regime. You shouldn't forget about that. Nobody talks about the way life should be arranged in the territory that would remain under the Ukrainian control. They say not a single word about restoring the rights of Russian-speaking population and Russians, and lifting the ban on the Russian language in all walks of life, and lifting a ban on the work of the Orthodox Ukrainian Church, canonical church. These tasks were included in the first Donald Trump proposal that is well known as a 28-point proposal.
That proposal mentioned the need to address the issue of the Russian language as well as the Russian Orthodox Church. The subsequent revisions which we have seen, the most recent ones, well, we have not seen those yet. The documents that are an outcome of the talks Ukraine, the US and Europe have had over the recent weeks, but the proposals we had last year, those 20 points, they didn't mention anything about re-establishing the rights of the Russian language of the canonical Russian Orthodox Church. There was some mention in those proposals on the parties engaging themselves to show tolerance with regard to one another. Ukraine would follow the EU's norms in terms of national minorities. Maybe even the word national is not there, because if it's the EU, we're talking about anything is possible. So these are not international standards, and the UN Charter in particular, which requires that the human rights have to be respected regardless of the race, language, or religion, or gender. No, these are the EU norms we are talking about, and they will be adjusted in the way that would fit Zelensky and Ukraine. So the proposal on the settlement, which seeks to preserve the Nazi regime and the part of Ukraine which will still bear that name, is absolutely unacceptable. I think I've deviated far away from the original question. What was the second part of your question? The second one was about the liberation of the Russian citizens from the Marinera crew. Yes, the moment we learned that the tanker was seized, we addressed an urgent demand to the American side, asking to liberate our citizens. There are 2 Russian citizens alongside Ukrainian, Indian citizens. We were assured the very same day or the next morning that the decision had been made at the highest level on setting them free, but unfortunately the subsequent days have demonstrated that this decision is not being respected. We are waiting for our American counterparts to keep the promise that we got from them. But generally speaking, all this business with capturing tankers and contravention of the international law at high seas, and a suspicion that does not fit the criteria for arresting or seizing vessels stipulated by the UNCLOS, is a source of concern. This is yet another example of actions that put the international law to the test. We're not saying that the norms stipulated in the 1982 Convention on the Law of the Seas are eternal. Life has changed since that time, almost 50 years it has been. But if it's the case, we have to get to the table and talk about how to behave ourselves at the high seas and within the special economic zones. A lot has been said about the US, so it's only fair to give the floor to CNN. You will allow it to come here, CNN? Yes, the second row, please. You don't believe your luck? Please ask your question.
Thank you very much, Matthew Chance from CNN. You've, Mr. Lavrov, repeatedly praised President Trump for understanding Russia's interests on the issue of Ukraine, for instance, but you've also criticized recent US moves against Russian allies in Venezuela, in Iran, threats against Cuba, things like that. My question is, to what extent do you think that inconsistency, that unpredictability, that willingness to use unconstrained power by President Trump actually in itself represents a threat to Russia?
Во-первых, я в своем вступительном слове.
Well, from the outset, I spoke about Cuba and Venezuela in my opening remarks, as well as about Iran, and we see the inconsistency in actions by the administration of Donald Trump in terms of ensuring international security and their attitude towards international law. When asked this question several days ago, Donald Trump said he was not interested in international law. All the norms in the international arena were set by his own morality, as he said. This is a very interesting statement. We have never counted or expected that with any country or our neighbors we would have absolutely coinciding position. These positions cannot coincide absolutely, nor can it be the case between the two biggest nuclear powers, the US and Russia. I think it's a very good chance right now to remember what New York Times has recently reported on. This newspaper prepared an article, it's called Godfather in Riyadh. It says that Marco Rubio, during his talks with myself and with my delegation in Riyadh in February 2025, as New York Times has said, has basically switched on the film lover mode, citing Godfather. He allegedly cited Corleone, saying that I've always tried to be not to be careless. Women and children can be careless, but men cannot be, and nuclear powers cannot be careless. This conversation did happen, and if Marco Rubio thought it possible to share that with the press, I think I can do the same, and I can share some more details. At the very beginning of our meeting in Riyadh, Marco said, I'm not going to quote directly, I do not remember, but the essence is there, the gist is there, I remember that very well. He said, foreign policy of the US under President Trump is set by national interests as well as common sense. This means that the US recognizes that its leading partners also have their own national interests. Well, he didn't say all countries of the world, but he said leading partners, the other great powers, all have their national interests. And then he continued, the national interests of such countries as the US and Russia will not always coincide. In most cases, they won't coincide at all. But should they coincide, whenever that happens, it would be a gross mistake not to take advantage of those coinciding positions to come to an agreement and implement mutually beneficial projects in economy and investment and finance and so on and so forth. And then he added, when the national interests of such countries as Russia and the US do not coincide, it would be a crime to let that lack of coinciding positions to degenerate into a confrontation, especially a hot confrontation. And in my response to him, I said that I fully share that philosophy, that logic, and I said that I do hope that I'm happy that the U.S. understands that such a position articulated by Marco Rubio is well-founded. Eurasia has also been mentioned, so let's give the floor to Eurasia Journal. They are with us as well. Good afternoon, Eurasia Journal. Minister Lavrov, I ask the question every year. What's the view of the European community towards the development of the Eurasian Economic Union? And secondly, the Eurasian Economic Union has this union state as its part, the union state of Russia and Belarus. That's good. But are there any plans to develop closer ties, closer relations with the countries of Central Asia? Given that Central Asia was a very good backbone during the Soviet times. Yes, it was the heart of the world. If I grasped the question correctly, you asked about the EU's attitude towards the Eurasian economic integration. Well, I do not know directly about the attitude because the EU has never commented on these processes. It has only sought to undermine those processes under the slogan of its right to develop its relations with any partner they choose. It started long before the Eurasian Economic Union was established. Basically, ignoring the Organization for Black Sea Cooperation, the EU adopted its own strategy for cooperation, and the Black Sea back then we still had contacts, and we asked them, don't you think it's odd that, you've got an organization which geographically represents the countries of the Black Sea? You do not have the quorum for those who are represented in the Black Sea, and you are proposing your own concept, but they were not bothered about that in the least. So whenever they want to get something, whenever they want to do damage, and it's Russia they want to do damage to in particular, they think they have the right to interfere. And the same applies to their relations with Central Asia, incidentally. Central Asia is a magnet, a lodestone for many partners. And this format, the Central Asian 5 countries, it exists. And I think there is a dozen of countries and structures like the EU, but there are also Central Asia plus France plus Germany. So there are different configurations. There are Central Asian formats with the participation of South Korea, Japan, China, Turkey. So until a certain point in time, we thought that since we were cooperating with our Central Asian countries within the CSTO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, within the CIS, and within the Eurasian Economic Union, then we didn't think it necessary to set up such a separate format, 5 Central Asian countries and Russia. But several years ago, we thought that it was necessary, and last year we had the second summit, Central Asia, Russia. A number of documents has been adopted covering all tracks of our cooperation. So I wouldn't say that we are not paying enough attention to Central Asia. And if you have this view, it would be very interesting for us if you could send us a paper explaining why you have this impression. Now, as for the cooperation between the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union, this cooperation does not exist. The EU is trying to do damage, to undermine the Union. They say that anyone who wants to develop their country should contemplate joining the EU. They're trying to involve Armenia right now. But we've got an initiative with our Belarusian friends on Eurasian security as well as on a Greater Eurasian Partnership. And this initiative implies the participation of all countries of the continent. That means that the doors are open to Europe. You know, there's been already 3 Minsk conferences on security. It has regularly been attended by the Foreign Minister of Hungary. There were representatives of Slovakia. And when this Eurasian Security Conference takes place in Minsk, I think the number of European countries represented will be expanded. You know, we've got this tradition running. So Armenia has been mentioned. We are giving the floor to Armenia. Alpha News. Good afternoon, Minister. I'd like to ask you about Russian-Armenian relations. There are 3 aspects I'd like to cover. First, your comment on the persecutions against the Apostolic Church. You know, within the country and in the West, they are motivated by the authorities overtly as aimed at countering the Russian influence. You know, the mayor of Gyumri, he faced criminal proceedings allegedly for trying to criticize the sovereignty because there was a proposal on the union state. And what do you think about Prime Minister Pashinyan's attitude towards the membership in the Eurasian Economic Union and the EU? Incidentally, I've spoken on this subject on multiple occasions. You know, I mean, this topic of this interrelationship between membership in the Eurasian Economic Union and the European Union. I spoke with my counterpart, the Foreign Minister of Armenia, and I spoke about that with Prime Minister Pashinyan. I think it was 12 months or 18 months ago when I last visited Yerevan. To anyone who has but the slightest notion of how the Eurasian Economic Union is operating or the EU is operating, it is evident that it is impossible to transition to the EU standards while remaining a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. This is something that we have heard on multiple occasions from Deputy Prime Minister Overchuk. He explained that during his contacts with his counterparts from Armenia. Technically, this is impossible. And they're not just incompatible because there are different norms, different standards in trade or investment which do not fit one another. But also because Brussels, well, the EU, Brussels, it represents, is persistently promoting the idea of transforming the legal framework of Armenia, making it compatible with the European standards. And as I said, in particular with regard to Serbia, these standards imply the need to join all EU policies such as the anti-Russian sanctions, the anti-Russian rhetoric. Just recently, in December last year, a new strategic agenda was signed for the partnership between Armenia and the EU, and it enumerates all of that. There needs to be coordination in foreign policy, in trade, in liberalizing the visa regime. But this visa liberalization regime is conditioned on the EU having a voice in terms of border protection. You know, Russian border officers are in Armenia, so the question begs itself how it's going to fit current Armenia's obligations. So this drift towards EU membership, which has been announced and which has become the subject of a special law adopted by Armenia, can hardly be compatible with remaining a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. So should Armenia make this decision, as Prime Minister has said if it is in conformity with the will of the Armenian nation, well, then it's the will of the citizens. But it's hardly possible to ignore the economic factors and the economic indicators we can see over the last decade. Armenia has become a fully fledged member of the Eurasian Economic Union back in 2015. Back then, its GDP stood at 10.5 billion US dollars, whereas right now this GDP has risen to 26 billion. So it is more than doubled. It's more than 2.5 times more. And all during the time that Armenia has been part of the Eurasian Economic Union.
The fact that within the Eurasian Economic Union there is free access to the Armenian goods to other markets of the Union countries. The Armenian foreign trade volume, primarily with the Russian Federation, has reached record high and now is standing at $14 billion, which is unprecedented. I'm giving you the statistics since you asked me about the relation between this strive towards the membership in the EU. How does it go along with a continued membership within the Eurasian Economic Union? I'm sure that the Armenian nation is to choose and their path as well as the Armenian leadership. However, to have both memberships is impossible. As for the attitude towards the Armenian Apostolic Church, naturally, we see it with regret, the way the situation is unfolding. And the Speaker of the National Assembly of Armenia, Mr. Simenon, gave Prime Minister Pashinyan, in his recent interview, did not deny that there are hybrid threats towards Armenia coming from the Russian Federation, hybrid threats that has to do with the situation in the Armenian Apostolic Church. We were simply confused by these statements. As for the rapprochement with the EU has consequences, I simply cannot help but mention that, because the EU always keeps mentioning the hybrid threats coming from the Russian Federation, and they fund such work. Recently, 15 million euros tranche was transferred to Armenia, and I'm sure that the Brussels bureaucracy will make our Armenian friends work for each and every euro cent out of those 15 million lump sum. Also, as for Armenia, when they try to convince them that they need to get away from Russia, the very Kaja Kallas has said that in Yerevan, Moscow will act according to the Moldova scenario. If you remember, the Moldova scenario was as following, that the election results were tampered with, and the very regime has lost those elections with 44% of the votes, and only could keep in power due to blatant violations at 200 voting stations in Europe, though they opened only 2 voting stations in Russia, and in Transnistria there were also very few, about 10. So if Kaja Kallas openly recognizes that during the upcoming elections in Armenia the Moldova scenario will be used, then if I was the Armenian community, the Armenian nation, I would consider that very seriously. As for Vartan Gugasan, you've mentioned in a very justified way that he's been accused of saying that it's possible to view the possibility of Armenia joining the union state of Russia and Belarus, arresting the person for presenting his political views, the political views that are not aimed at undermining the sovereignty or territorial integrity of Romania, a statement aimed at maximizing the opportunities for foreign relations in the interests of development of the country, that also caused confusion and serious concern. I know that he has been released but remains under house arrest. We expect that the political figures in Armenia that advocate for deeper cooperation with Russia will not be persecuted. Since we spoke about Moldova, let's move to Sputnik. Minister Kirill Orlov, Sputnik. Yes, I wanted to ask you a question about Moldova. You've already mentioned the Moldova scenario. And quite recently, the president of Moldova, Maya Sandu, mentioned that she would support the entry of the neutral state, according to constitution, of its accession to Romania, a NATO country. And at a referendum, she would vote for that. My question is, what's the Russian take on the possibility of such scenario in principle? As for a proposal of President Trump, you've mentioned it before. I would like to ask you about. I would like to ask you more details about Trump's initiative, but the idea of the new organization that would deal with the matters of peace, initially with the Gaza issue. Do you think such an organization would be capable of helping the world? Does the world need more new organization? What's the Russian view on that? As for Moldova, its policy towards the rapprochement with the European Union, or rather being consumed by the European Union, since we hear more and more voices about the reunification or joining Romania will be the closest path towards the membership in the European Union, that policy destroys the Moldovan statehood, and it creates the impression that the European Union has a stake in that. We can see that in many facts. For example, Moldovan language has been renamed as Romanian language. The school textbooks, instead of history of Moldova, they teach the history of Romania. The Nazi henchmen, such as Antonescu, have been claimed to be national heroes, and historical facts regarding this, not just the Second World War, but the previous and the further development of the region, have been distorted very blatantly or simply ignored. Anti-Russian narratives have been pushed through. We have been accused of all sins, of all issues in the Moldovan Republic, also in essential collapse of the economy and social sphere, growing unemployment and poverty levels, and outflow of population. We are also accused of that. As far as I remember, the external debt of Moldova stands at about $12 billion, and the population is about 2,400,000. I think it's a catastrophic level of debt per capita in terms of future social and economic development. Poverty level is sky high. Number of people with low income is about 2/3 of the population. Other economic indicators, balance deficit and lower export to the European Union as well. Well, beautiful words should always be matched against the actions. Nevertheless, we see that the Sandu administration members keep saying, despite the examples of Ukraine and the Baltic states, and the EU does not need an independent Moldova. This is pure geopolitical calculation. Possibly there are political forces in Moldova, I hope that it is so, forces that are aware of what's happening, and they're following the opinion of a majority of the Moldovan nation. It is for a reason that the Sandu regime among the Moldovan people who live in the country was not supported. They did not receive a majority during the latest elections. We have every interest in good relations with Moldova. We give them no reason, though they've been instigated by the European Union, to undertake any hostile action. However, unfortunately, the EU follows the current Chisinau authorities, which are completely subjugated to them. A lot has been said about Kaja Kallas while she's thinking about the future of the EU. Let's talk about the Baltic states. Balt News, please. Balt News, Россия сегодня. I'm here. Hello, Minister, Madam Zakharova. Over the past years, Baltic states have become a military stronghold for the whole NATO. Moreover, there are multiple provocations happening against Russia in the territory of the Baltic. The navigation is hampered. Moreover, the Baltics are standing in the way of Chinese maritime logistics. Hence the question. As for diplomatic concerns and so on, what kind of other measures can be undertaken by Russia? Well, the Baltic states have already become notorious. In the past 2 or 3 years, the EU and NATO were keeping up on building militant anti-Russian rhetoric, calling to prepare for the war against Russia. Together with the Germans, the Baltic states were also very vocal, including their leadership. As for accusations that were placed against Russia, you are fully aware of them, of all those statements coming from presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, defense ministers. Tremendous and unclear sense of superiority can be seen in all those statements, and I do not know how is that matched by the real role played by the Baltic states. Possibly it has to do with a chronic disease. When the 3 Baltic states were adopted in the EU, that they acceded to the EU in 2004, they were absolutely not in line with all the criteria for the membership. Just like what's happening with Ukraine right now, it does not only satisfy all the demands, but it violates all of them. Back in the day when we had good relations with the EU, with Romano Prodi at the head of the European Commission, well, we asked them that they've been rather careless in engaging them in the EU. They will be a burden for the normal functioning of that trade and economic structure that the EU was at the time. We were told that, yes, there's certain nuance there. They did not grow up entirely to be fully fledged members. However, for political reasons, we'd like to take them in. After the Baltic states received independence in 1989, after they received independence, they continue to have phobias against the Russian Federation. Well, we were told that they're afraid that you will attack them, therefore will accept them to the EU and NATO, and they will come down. They did not. On the contrary, in the EU and NATO as well, they started to play the role, the first violin in instigating Russophobic sentiment, and that continues to this day. What's the specific result from that membership they can show to their population? Well, let's look at the statistics as well. What's left of the population in those states? After a great number of people went looking for a better life to Europe or other parts of the world, what's the economic growth shown by the countries? What are the GDP per capita indicators? And many other notions here. From the very beginning of the independence and further participation of the Baltic countries in NATO and the EU, Europe disregarded the blatant violations of human rights. That is a very well-known fact. The attitude towards Russian language, for example, however, they did not reach the Zelensky violation levels. And the ban of the language in all spheres of life has not been declared in the Baltic states. However, certain sectors such as education and mass media, as well as culture, are being targeted by these bans on the language. The Estonian Orthodox Church is yet another example, among many, along with the decisions on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, follows the narrow policy of the Istanbul Patriarch. I cannot call him the Patriarch of Constantinople. His policy of undermining the traditional Orthodox Church. I've mentioned Armenia. In the context of the Orthodox Church, the Armenian Apostolic Church. This is a trend. We cannot help but notice this trend. They're violating the human rights enshrined in the UN Charter. I can quote again that the human rights, the rights of every person, must be observed, regardless of their religion. I suggest we move up to the Northern Europe. We have Iceland. And I see Central Europe, Italy and Spain. Please prepare yourselves. Happy New Year. Minister, Madam Zakharova, I represent Iceland. And American imperialism, if we speak frankly, has reached new levels. For 150 years, they've been dealing with the Southern Hemisphere, poor Latin American countries, Arab countries, and Africa, and so on. Now they're talking about acquiring Greenland by military force. William Long, the future U.S. ambassador to Reykjavik, stated that he will make Iceland the 52nd state of the United States, and he will be the governor. So the U.S. are looking with a greedy eye on Iceland and Greenland. Nuuk and Reykjavik are two capitals of these islands. If they placed a special request to the Russian Federation, or if there was a certain treaty between us, what would you say? We see the deterioration of European elites, and Sergei Karaganov is an important person in Russian political structures, and he said in his interview to Tucker Carlson, our colleague, that this would be undesirable, but it is quite possible to use nuclear weapons against the European continent, and he will choose Germany. So what's your question? What's your take on the first part of the question? If Nuuk and Reykjavik send you a request, but what's the request from Nuuk or from Reykjavik, the two capitals, about the treaty with the Russian Federation, about friendship and cooperation as a beginning, and possible military cooperation? And the second question, if you could comment on the words of Mr. Karaganov. As for Mr. Karaganov, I would not comment on that. He's the only person who can control our nuclear arsenal. That's our commander-in-chief, the president of the Russian Federation. Our nuclear policy is a transparent and published document. We update it regularly, and you can read up on that. As for a hypothetical proposal from Greenland and Iceland, as far as I understand, to sign a treaty about mutual aid with the Russian Federation, you know, I don't see conditions that would allow for such a possibility to even be considered. And I don't think that anyone in Nuuk or Reykjavik is even thinking in that direction. The logic of your question is is going down the wrong road. It means that you would like for these poor territories, which is one is soon to be acquired, and the second one will be the next, for them to run to us for help. We're not saying that someone did not help them, Russia or China or anybody else. What we're talking about is that they're members of NATO. And this alliance right now is being put to the test. What's its worth? We absolutely have no interest in interfering in anyone's affairs. If we talk about Greenland, well, that's part of the issue that has to do with the consequences of the colonial era, starting with the 13th century. Greenland essentially was a Norwegian colony, starting with the 18th, the very beginning of the 20th century. It was the Denmark's colony.
And by the mid-20th century, an agreement was signed according to which it is part of Denmark, not as a colony, but as an associated territory. It was associated with the European Union, but in principle, Greenland is not a natural part of Denmark, is it? It was not a natural part of Norway or Denmark. It was the colonial acquired state. Well, people got used to that, and that's the other matter. But the problem of former colonial powers, well, it is something that is becoming more urgent. According to the UN, there are 17 territories that either do not have sovereignty or are directly dependent on the ruling powers. Unlike and at odds with the UNSC resolutions, France keeps the island of Mayotte. Judging by all of the decisions of the United Nations, it is part of the Comoros. The UK keeps the Malvinas in violation of multiple resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly. Britain also keeps the Mauritius island of Chagos archipelago. There are multiple examples. French Polynesia, Epars Islands, that are still kept by the French Republic. Therefore, these issues will be raised in the future as well, and it's not by chance that within the UN Group in Defense of the UN Charter, we adopted a very important initiative, namely to launch a campaign within the United Nations to clean up all remains of the colonial age. As I've mentioned, on the 14th of December every year, upon our initiative, we will celebrate within the United Nations the Day against colonialism in all forms and manifestations. When it comes to Greenland specifically, you know, I written some references, some quotes. Mr. Milanovic, he's a well-seasoned politician, he called President Trump not to put his interest before the interests of the people of Greenland. He highlighted that the decision on the future of Greenland shall be made solely by the people of Greenland. You could put the people of Crimea instead of the people of Greenland, and a lot would be more clear to you. In Crimea, people had a referendum after the anti-constitutional coup, when the putschists that came to power unleashed a war against the Russian language, and they sent fighters to storm the Supreme Council of Crimea. In Greenland, there was no coup, but as President Trump said, this territory is simply important for the security of the US. Crimea is equally important for the security of Russia. And when they justify what is going on around Greenland by saying that otherwise China or Russia would seize it. There is no proof of that. And in the West, economists and political scientists even expose it. By the way, Annalena Baerbock, that is currently the president of the UN General Assembly, stated that the people of Greenland made their position crystal clear, namely the right to self-determination. When they say such things, they should have thought in advance, or they should have thought about the past, what they said about the right to self-determination for the people of Donbass and Novorossiya. In other words, we believe that we have nothing to do with this issue. Naturally, we monitor the situation. That is a serious geopolitical situation. And we will draw our conclusions following the outcome of this matter. Colonialism was mentioned, just like island nations issues. And let us give the floor to Sky News, the British representatives. By the way, Maria said Britain, and without any insults, I believe that Britain should be called Britain, because a Great Britain is the only example when a country calls itself great. Another example was the Libyan Jamahiriya, which is no longer existing. Over to you. No offense.
None taken. Ivor Bennett from Sky News. First of all, on Greenland, you say there's no proof that Russia and China would seize Greenland, but that's not answering the question or the issue posed by Donald Trump, who says that Russia is a threat to Greenland. So my question is Russia a threat? Is he right? Do you have designs on Greenland? And if not, how do you respond to his desire to acquire it? Do you support or oppose it? And on the issue of colonialism, how is what Russia is doing in Ukraine different to colonialism that you have railed against here? Russia has annexed Ukraine. It's now trying to take, annexed Crimea. It's now trying to take 4 eastern territories by force. How is that different to colonialism?
Well, with regard to Greenland, I've already said everything. We have nothing to do with plans to seize Greenland, and I have no doubts whatsoever that Washington clearly understands that there are no such plans by Russia or the PRC. It's not our issue. Our issue is that we're interested in establishing an open, free Arctic cooperation within the Arctic Council, where the security interests and the interests of economy, environment, and the indigenous peoples of all countries of the Arctic Council would be taken into account. We were not the ones who halted cooperation within this entity, and we were not the ones who severed contacts. Incidentally, the United States shows their interest in resuming discussions within the Arctic Council, unlike some Europeans, although at the technical level there are still such contacts. Therefore, many didn't even know about Greenland. I'm talking about our citizens, until the moment when it was the top news. Well, you should decide it within the North Atlantic Alliance. Will take a look at how this issue will be resolved. Regarding colonialism, well, we have a lot of proverbs that could be applied to this question that you have asked. You know, when Joe Biden met with Vladimir Putin in June 2021, and there was this restricted format meeting engaging only Blinken and yours truly, and Biden, without any notes, without any memos, made his introductory remarks, and he said the following: the United States and Russia are two great powers. We're not better than you, we're not worse, we're just different. The United States was created following migration of semi-criminal elements from England, and they started living in their territories. They addressed the Indians' problem. Then there were the issues of slavery, migration, and all those who came to the US, starting with English settlers. All of them went to this melting pot, and they were melted regardless of their ethnic and other origins, and they turned to be Americans, and they went out of this melting pot with the human rights motto on their forehead. And you were created in a different way. That's what Joe Biden said. You developed neighboring territories, neighboring Moscovia, not by suppressing peoples, not by melting peoples, but by joining them, preserving their languages, traditions, religions, culture, and so on. And right now, you have a vast country, the biggest country in the world as per the territory, where you have the most multi-ethnic population, and you preserve this multi-ethnicity at the state level. And that is why, as Biden said, it's hard for you to keep the country, especially a country that has nuclear weapons, in a state of unity. And Mr. President Putin, I respect you for managing to do that. That's what he said. I cannot imagine Russia to be falling apart. That's the case when Joe Biden was speaking without teleprompter, without autopen, that signed everything for himself. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that colonialism in the international law is applied by the states who had, and for the states who had colonies, and their colonies did not want to live with the colonial powers. It's not by chance that in 1960 there was the decolonization process, and as I've mentioned, it is not finalized. Britain unlawfully keeps a host of territories, including the Chagos Archipelago, and it's not by chance that in 1960 the United Nations General Assembly adopted a declaration by consensus, and Britain spoke in favor of it, just like the US and everybody else, including the Europeans, the Declaration on the Principles of International Law and the Principles of Interstate Relations. And as it compared the UN Charter principles, primarily the principle of territorial integrity and the principle of national self-determination, this declaration made the following conclusion: all states shall respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of those states whose governments respect the right of self-determination and represent the whole population living at their respective territory. In 1960s, the peoples of Africa clearly stipulated and claimed that the colonial powers London, Paris, Madrid, Lisbon do not represent the interests of the population of the relevant colonial territories. And the decolonization process unfolded in 2014, and afterwards, following the coup in Ukraine, the people of Crimea, followed by the people of Novorossiya and Donbass, through referenda, expressing their will openly, decided that the Kiev authorities that came to power following a coup do not represent the population of the respective territories. And with all due respect, it's not about colonialism or annexation, it's about respect and implementation of the principles adopted by consensus at the UN General Assembly with the agreement of all our Western colleagues, including Britain. As promised, the floor to the EU media. Rai, over to you.
Vladirovna, and thank you, Mr. Lavrov.
Sergey Viktorovich.
Sergey Viktorovich, that's right. And, well, this is Caterina Doglio, Italian television, RAI, and my question for you is, almost exactly last year, you said that Italian and Russians relations were in the deepest crisis, the deepest since the Second World War, that the government in Rome was responsible for that Italy was anti-Russia. And well, that was 2025. Now we are in 2026. Do you see any sign that there is a shift in this? There is a possibility of even a resumption of dialogue, especially after our Prime Minister Meloni said that, well, quoted French President Macron, and said that he was right in saying that it's time for Europe, it's time that Europe talked to Russia. Thank you.
Что касается
When it comes to relations with Italy and that they are at a rock bottom, I confirm what I said. Italy is one of few countries that is scared of Russian art currently. Its government, or the governments of your regions, in some cases, cancel the tours of our opera singers that were previously agreed upon. This was the case with the tour of Eldar Abdrazakov. Previously, there were a couple of other examples when the stars of world art from Russia were invited, arrangements were reached, and then these tours were cancelled. I do not want to compare it, but still this struggle and this fight against art, it is not natural for the Italian people. Well, that's my feeling, judging from my conversations with the Italians. I do not know how to talk about that. There are examples, but they have to do with the Nazi regime in Ukraine. They established this Institute for National Memory, and recently they made another decision stating that Kutuzov, Ivan Bunin, Alexander Griboyedov are the symbols of Russian imperialism, and this all should be banned. Add to this list Pushkin, Lermontov, Tolstoy, and by the way, such prominent writers as Ilfan Petrov and Mikhail Bulgakov. Ukrainian Nazis have long learned, taught the whole world that they can do that, and this is allowed by the EU and NATO members, primarily the EU members. But expecting the ban on the art and culture by Italy, well, I didn't expect that. Venice Biennale, we have this pavilion and we're not allowed to use it, and the owners are renting it. Last time the Venice Biennale took place, our representatives just gave it our pavilion to Latin American representatives, namely to Bolivia. How is it in line with the Italian mood and their way of life and the Italian tolerance or zero tolerance to politicizing people-to-people contacts? I do not know. What was the second question? The question on whether it is possible to resume relations. Well, President Putin has repeatedly stated that we were not the ones who severed relations. We were not the ones who closed all the doors for Russia-EU cooperation. And in EU, there are some long-standing friends of ours, such as Italians. Now I'm being asked, Macron said something, Meloni said something, and what's your take on that? It's not very serious, when leaders of European countries, including the ones that I've mentioned, throughout 4 years, they've been stating that it is not possible to sit at one negotiating table with Russia, and all of a sudden, when they want to stand out from those who claim that we need to inflict a strategic defeat upon Russia, they say, well, Merz said, for instance, Russia is a European country and we need to talk with them. So those who want to talk with us in a serious manner, I advise you not to talk about it loudly and to proudly look at the audience. If you are seriously interested, you just simply need to call us, as it is a custom among diplomats.
Oh, what is it? Like a threat? I'm going to talk to Putin? Macron has announced yet another time. I think it was last year, some time ago, when President Emmanuel Macron gave a call to President Putin. Not a thing out of what he said during that telephone conversation had been any different from what Paris, including Macron himself, had been saying and continue to say publicly. In November last year, President Macron met Zelensky. I couldn't help jotting down a quote. After the meeting with Zelensky, Macron said it was Russia that chose the path of war. Nothing could justify that war, not one single threat, only false ones, all of that in complete contempt of the truth, under the influence of reflexes of a country that cannot put up with its history. Just rude. Just kind of spitting on Russia. But we are above that, and we treat such statements not with disdain, but, we don't make much of them. Well, take anyone, but the French are supposed to remember Russia's history. They can't help understanding that history is not about what Kaja Kallas has said about 19 wars that Russia has unleashed against Europe over the last 100 years. No, they should remember that there was an invasion mounted by Napoleon, later succeeded by Hitler, who armed the whole Europe in order to defeat Russia and ensure its collapse. And this history is something we will never abandon. Well, let Macron bear responsibility for his own words, as well as for the statements that there's going to be a war between Europe and Russia. I think the last time this was said, it was said by, I think, Pistorius. I think it's Defense Minister of Germany. So we will never abandon this history, and still we understand that it is hardly possible to agree on anything with the current leaders of Europe because they have painted themselves into a corner of hatred against Russia. If the French journalists would like to clarify something, we'll give them this chance. But for the time being, let's move to Asia. China's youth newspaper. Thank you, Madam Zakharova, for this chance to ask my question. My question is as follows. The history of Russian-Chinese culture has been a success in 2025. What's your take on the successes between China and Russia in cultural exchanges? What kind of positive impact can such exchanges among the Chinese and Russian youth facilitate greater mutual understanding and cultural exchange between the people of China and the people of Russia? Thank you. Our relations with China occupy a very special place in the hierarchy of our foreign policy priorities, and the same applies to the foreign policy pursued by the People's Republic of China. Our relations have reached unseen heights, something which has been remarked upon by both President Putin and President Xi. And of course, culture plays an important part in that. Culture plays an important part in historical memory, as well as our willingness to defend our values in the international arena. In that regard, last year was particularly important, given the fact that the leaders of Russia and China participated reciprocally in the events to celebrate the victory over Nazi Germany in May in Moscow, and the defeat of militarist Japan in September last year in Beijing. And on both these occasions, our leaders held new rounds of talks, charting the course into the future for our strategic cooperation as well as partnership. I'm not even going to touch upon the economic aspect of our relations, even though economy is the material foundation of relations, and for many years in a row we have been reaching new record highs. But as far as humanitarian cooperation is concerned, it's being strengthened day in, day out. You've mentioned the years of Russian culture in China and vice versa, of Chinese culture in Russia. These years, hundreds of different events have been organized both on the Russian soil and over there in China. And their New Year messages to one another, both President Putin and President Xi have announced a new initiative, namely 2026 and 2027 will be the years of education between Russia and China, and that constitutes an important element of cultural exchanges as well as youth exchanges. So the year that has already started is going to be rich in these events. We're promoting youth contacts in sport between our archival services, which is also important to preserve national culture, national traditions, as well as national identity. Cultural contacts and other contacts will be facilitated by the visa-free regime that is already in force. You know, the statistics on the trips, reciprocal trips, show us new record highs, and I think this trend will continue. So our humanitarian cooperation is very rich and multifaceted, and it is a very good complement to our economic cooperation as well as our coordination and foreign policy in the international arena, where both Russia and China serve as most important factors for stabilization. And against this backdrop, this importance is only growing. Vietnam. Over to you, please. Minister Lavrov, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the chance to ask you a question just like last year. These days, Vietnam is playing host to a very important event. That is the Congress of the ruling party of Vietnam, the Communist Party of Vietnam, which is gonna set the course for the next 5 years. My question is as follows. As Russia's top diplomat, what are your expectations and what are your takes on the outcomes of this Congress for strengthening our cooperation and bilateral relations between Russia and Vietnam? From the outset, as for my expectations from this Congress, I think it's not for me to say. These expectations are something that the people of Vietnam have to decide on. We know that the Communist Party of Vietnam is Vietnam's ruling party, and traditionally, since Vietnam's victory in its anti-colonial fight, it's the party that sets the course for development. We actively support the efforts of our Vietnamese counterparts with a view to developing their society, economy, foreign ties, including fraternal ties with the Russian Federation. And apart from contacts at the level of our presidents, as well as at the level of the heads of our government, we promote by every means possible inter-party contacts between the Communist Party of Vietnam and Russia's ruling party, which is United Russia. But we know that the Russian Communist Party also has contacts with the Communist Party of Vietnam. We have no doubts whatsoever that the leading role of Vietnam's Communist Party is in the interest of the people of Vietnam, so we will be expecting the outcomes of the Congress and will take that into account when building further plans for strengthening our relations, our partnership, and the special ties with Vietnam. Kyoda Tsusin, please. Japan. The last row. Distinguished Minister, my name is Nana Kashimura. I'm from Kyoda Tsushin Information Agency. Thank you for the opportunity to ask my question. The new Prime Minister of Japan says that she follows the course of the previous leader of Japan, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. This question is as follows. The thing is, the people tied to the Northern Territories are becoming older, and it is becoming increasingly important to sort the issue of visiting the gravestones of their ancestors in the Kuril Islands. This is an important humanitarian issue. What's your take on that? And what are the prospects for resuming the dialogue between Russia and Japan amid current conditions? Thank you. In my opening remarks, I have made brief mention of Japan. I expressed my concern that alongside Germany, Japan is also demonstrating some unhealthy trends tied to the willingness of certain political forces to get back to militarizing Japanese society. We are following the unfolding of the military and strategic cooperation between Japan and the US. We are following the joint military activities in your region, around Japan, and on the soil of Japan, with the participation of extra-regional players. I'm not just talking about the US, but also other members of NATO. All of that is happening in close proximity to Russia's borders. And given the chaotic nature of international developments, as it were, this can't help being a source of concern to us. We have come to know a number of factors that have a direct bearing on the interests of our security. Through diplomatic channels, we have communicated to our Japanese neighbors the inadmissibility of the deployment of the U.S. ground-based offensive systems that happened last year, but in September 2025 at the U.S. Armed Forces base Iwakuni and in Yamakushi. These batteries of the Typhoon system, the strike systems, ground-based systems, have been deployed. We were told that it was on a temporary basis for some military drills, but according to our information, these offensive systems, the Typhoon systems, which are meant to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles, are still in Japan. So maybe it's not just about military drills, maybe this is more about a permanent presence. If I can say that we have had no official communication that these systems have been withdrawn, so we are still very much concerned about that. In October last year, your defense minister, Mr. Koizumi, announced the plans for deploying mid-range missiles on the Isle of Yonaguni next to China's Taiwan, which is probably not the most peaceable move. On multiple occasions in our direct contacts with the Japanese neighbors as well as in the public space, we have drawn their attention to the fact that such steps have a negative impact on stability and security in the region. We have called upon our Japanese partners not to follow the path of remilitarization and rather to get back to the position that has been enshrined in your constitution. This principle stipulates that you pursue a defensive policy, an exclusively defensive policy in your constitution. But unfortunately, your administration has been ignoring our calls. We are convinced that this is not a healthy situation. You know, we have had some parliamentary contacts. We have never denied or declined these contacts, and we're hopeful that this will help the Japanese leadership get a better grasp of Russia's legitimate interests. It'll give them a better understanding of the need to remain committed to the principles that have been enshrined in the Japanese constitution as well as in the UN Charter as far as the outcomes of the Second World War are concerned. That said, against this backdrop, getting back to the question asked by our colleague from Italy, I would like to say that cultural and humanitarian cooperation with Japan, despite most profound differences in geopolitics, is developing in quite a positive fashion. We are not witnessing any attempts to cancel our culture or our art or our performers. Unlike what we are seeing in Italy, no one is trying to create any obstacles in the ways of annual events that take place as part of the Russian Culture Festival. All these years, this festival has been held, and it has always been a huge success. This year, Tokyo, the Japanese capital, is going to host the 20th such festival. Is going to be an anniversary. On our side, we're not going to prevent any Japanese cultural initiatives in Russia on our side either. We have not covered the Middle East yet, so let's move to the media that represent Greater Middle East. I see Al Jazeera. They've been raising their hand for quite some time. Over to you. Al Arabiya? Yes, they don't want. Yes, they do. Well, honestly, our question was not about the Middle East. We wanted to ask the following. On February the 5th, 2026, the New START treaty expires between Russia and the US. Putin has announced that so as not to provoke a new arms race and to ensure predictability and restraint, after February the 5th, Russia is willing to be committed to the New START limitations for a year, and Donald Trump has announced recently that should the New START expire, the U.S. is gonna enter into a more advantageous treaty with Russia. Can you comment on what this treaty will look like and whether China is going to be part of that treaty? Why are you asking me this question? Because it was the President of the U.S. that has said that. As you have said, we are committed to what President Putin has announced. He said that several months ago, so as not to create a complete vacuum in strategic stability, given the expiration of the New START treaty on February the 5th, 2026. He proposed, given the fact that the treaty had been suspended, he proposed that we should keep engaged, keep committed to the limits, to the ceilings stipulated by the new treaty. President Putin said that we would be willing to abide by those restrictions by another year, provided that the U.S. would reciprocate and would refrain from increasing its arsenals over the limits set in the treaty, so as to get another year to come down from the heated rhetoric engulfing the international politics, so that we could have a chance to charter a course forward in terms of strategic stability.
Meanwhile, we see that when President Trump was asked whether he will also observe the central limits on New START just as Russia would, he said, no, the treaty is expiring, let it. Indeed, the U.S. is signaling towards us that some new negotiations on strategic stability should start. They're mentioning China. All that is being done publicly during the conversation with journalists. As for specific contacts on that topic between the specialists of two countries, there are none. Simultaneously, we see the attempts by the United States to maintain their to create domination in certain spheres of strategic stability. I have already mentioned the forward deployment of ground-launched, shorter and mid-range missile Typhoon. I have already mentioned it today in Japan. It has appeared in Philippines as well as in Japan. They're planning to station it in Germany as well. I can also say that they're trying to expand the presence of their nuclear armaments in Europe. This has been mentioned publicly, and I can also mention the development of the global ballistic missile shield treaty called the Golden Dome. Let's not forget that the United States are conducting an active policy of weaponization of the outer space, of placing weapons in outer space. At the United Nations, we're trying to mobilize the global community in order to have a resolution on the first non-placement of weapons in outer space. The U.S. are trying to turn down that initiative, and they're asking us to support their initiative of non-placement of nuclear weapons in outer space. We agree to that, but however, the threat to the Earth is being created by the non-nuclear weapons that the U.S. is planning to place in outer space. And we suggest to adopt a resolution about non-placement of all weapons, but they agree only to the nuclear. That means that non-nuclear weapons will be, according to U.S. plans, will be stationed there. There are many issues in that regard. As for the second part of your question, if such negotiations were to start, who would participate? The People's Republic of China has outlined its position very clearly. They've clearly stated that the United States and the Russian Federation, in terms of their nuclear arsenal, in the numbers far beyond their capacities. And the People's Republic of China does not have the same arsenal. So at this stage, it does not see the need to participate in such negotiations. We have every respect for that position. However, if we do talk about the need to expand the presence of participants on the strategic stability of nuclear powers at a certain stage, we should not leave the UK and France behind. Together with the United States, their allies, they're tied down by the commitments, by mutual commitments within NATO. Therefore, not to consider their arsenals when we're talking about the threats projected by the nuclear arsenal of the United States is simply impossible. And like that Western Troika, a nuclear troika situation, we, with the People's Republic of China, do not have a military union. From a legal standpoint and practical standpoint, it's a very different situation. But I'd like to repeat myself, as for specific initiatives, there are none. It seems that everyone is dealing with a more pragmatic thing, and everyone knows fully well. We hear about them every day. Sorry, excuse me. I forgot who was asking that question. Someone added the topic about the Board of Peace proposed by President Trump. There was a question asked by someone, and now I remember that I forgot to respond to it when Al Jazeera refused to. Please wait a second. When Al Jazeera refused to ask a question about the Middle East. I have already said in my introductory remarks, and Dmitry Peskov confirmed that yesterday, that President Putin has received an invitation by President Trump to become a part of the Board of Peace. We have also received annex to that letter, a rather lofty document called a charter of the Board of Peace that states that the board will be prepared to deal not only with the Gaza sector, I don't think it's even mentioned there, but it would be tasked with the resolution of conflicts around the world. And naturally, we'd like to clear up the conceptual vision and the practical vision of our American colleagues of this initiative. We're trying to clear these matters up. We'll keep in touch. In general, when we're talking about the need to solve the Middle Eastern issues, primarily the Gaza sector, Gaza Strip issue, which was the raison d'etre for the mentioning of the Board of Peace, the resolution that was adopted in the fall last year at the U.S. initiative. We have the same position as the global community has confirmed multiple times in the UNGA and UNSC resolutions. When the U.S. initiative was reviewed in the fall in New York, we had doubts that there was a need for additional formats beyond those that were enshrined in the UN decisions. These decisions simply have to be executed. There is a need to create the Palestine state. It needs to be done through the direct dialogue between Israel and the Palestinian National Administration, National Authority. Back then, the initiators of those resolutions, who endorsed the Trump plan on Gaza sector, on Gaza Strip, did not want to reference the UN resolution. Therefore, we, together with China, simply abstained. We did not stand in the way of the adoption of that resolution, simply for the reason that the Palestinians themselves, and basically all Arab countries, appealed to us with a request to give a chance to this initiative. We did precisely that. We view that in that context, that invitation that we have received. We have an interest to use all those opportunities that would bring us closer to finding a solution for the Palestinian nation, primarily acute humanitarian issues caused by the hostilities by Israel that go beyond international humanitarian law, and everyone is aware of that. Following the humanitarian issues of the Palestinian nation, it will be necessary to make the next step towards the settlement of the political situation through, as we are still deeply convinced, through the implementation of the UN decisions. The Middle East cannot be stable without the creation of the Palestinian state. Iranian state radio. Minister, as you know, Russia and Iran are long-standing partners. Recently, Donald Trump stated that any country that would trade with Iran will be slammed with a 25% tariff. What do you think? How would that be reflected in our trade ties? Though we see the constant increase in our trade volume. Well, we're trading with you. The way we decided that way our trade would develop. We have great plans with the Islamic Republic of Iran, not only in trade but also in investment sphere. Bushehr nuclear power plant is being built actively. A very important part of the international transportation corridor south-north between Russia, Azerbaijan, and Iran is being built. Many other projects are in the pipeline, and I see no reason why we or our Iranian friends are to stop these projects. Yes, Donald Trump is using tariffs and duties as policy instruments. Every time that the unilateral restrictive measures are being used in trade and economic relation, it means that the initiator of those measures is not quite sure of its competitive edge on the global market. The life itself will solve this. President Macron incidentally said that he will not take part in the Board of Peace suggested by President Trump. And when Donald Trump learned about that, he said that he will introduce 200% tariffs against President Macron and his economy. Life is a lot more multifaceted than a certain specific situation. Al-Naidin, please. Madam Zakharova, Minister, thank you for this opportunity to ask a question. Active work is being done in terms of mediation by Russia to settle the situation in Iran. Are there any successes, or what are the result of active Russian mediation? We see highest level talks with Israel and with Iran. Are there any results? What are they? Can Russia use their mediation, rather successful mediation experience to possibly settle the situation that also has to do with Lebanon and Israel, considering rather strong ties that Russia has with these countries, both with Israel and Lebanon? Thank you. Naturally, considering that there is continued violations. We keep supporting the contacts with the Islamic Republic of Iran and with Israel leadership, with Lebanese friends as well. We don't try to publicize our successes and what we do. Your question mainly has to the fact that there was a leak that in contacts between Russia, Tehran, and Tel Aviv in the past months, in the last months of last year, there were certain discussions about understanding, not to threaten with an attack, and mutually Israel towards Iran and Iran towards Israel. Since that was leaked to the media, I can tell you that there were contacts at the initiative of our Israeli and Iranian friends, and every time that anyone appeals to us for aid, we are always happy to provide our good services, but we do not impose them on anyone. But when we are asked, we always respond positively. The same can be applied to the situation in Lebanon. We see how complex the situation is in the Middle East in general. Iran, Lebanon, since you mentioned it, Syria, including the Golan Heights, and adjacent territories that were recently under the UN control have been taken by Israel as well. There are agreements on Lebanon. However, we see information from time to time in the media that the Israeli leadership is not very intent to withdraw its units completely from the Lebanese territory. The bargaining is being done about the implementation of the Trump plan due to the creation of the Board of Peace that we've just mentioned. The bargaining is that how to interpret the need to disarm Hamas. Hamas seems to be prepared. However, Israel thinks it's not sufficient. There are a tremendous number of questions. How to free the Gaza Strip, and Israeli officials saying it openly that they don't want to leave from the entire territory. Therefore, it's very hard for me to say the way the plan will be implemented. There are many variables there. I think President Trump invited about 50 states to the Board of Peace, and that means that he understands that it's impossible to solve this issue alone, just like any other issue in the world. However realistic the chances seem to solve it unilaterally overnight in specific cases. The example of creation of the Board of Peace means that there is awareness about the need for group effort, and that's what's happening in Washington. But it bears repeating that if this a group of important countries invited to the Board of Peace, and if they can help to move forward towards the stabilization of the region, also by implementation of specific UN resolutions and decisions, Russia thinks that will be already useful. Komsomolskaya Pravda, please. Minister, we all know you as a defender of rights of our compatriots in many countries of the world. Lately, there have been many cases when our compatriots don't have the opportunity to confirm their citizenship when they live in other countries. It comes to the fact when sometimes citizens need to fill out the papers to confirm their citizenship to reapply to it. Can it be solved systemically? Does it mean that we're creating an institute of non-citizenship? We can't solve that issue, and we're dealing with it. Our ministry has initiated the interagency group format. The issue is rooted in the fact that in the 90s, when the Soviet structures were substituted by the Russian structures, when a tremendous number of compatriots, as we call them today, the citizens of the Soviet Union who felt themselves to be Russian, happened to be abroad, and you know what was happening. The trove of issues that we had to solve off the cuff. And the number of issues that you've just mentioned, I mean, receiving the Russian citizenship has to do with the fact that in many cases, our consulates gave foreign passports, international passports, to the Russian citizens. These people could not get internal passports. They didn't have time or did not want to travel to Russia, but they wanted to be a part of the Russian world. When these passports, international passports, expired, naturally they went to the consulates asking to renew these passports. Due to some bureaucratic reasons, they were asking for the confirmation of the Russian citizenship. I don't think it's quite right. The fact that they all were already issued a Russian international passport is proof enough. Maybe we could appeal to the fact that quite possibly there were cases when such passports were issued illegally. Their rules are always being violated, sometimes successfully, but all that could be checked and tracked, and together with the Ministry of the Interior and with Consulate and other visa-adjacent agency, we're working on that when we're preparing our report to the President. Belta, please. Good afternoon, Minister. I would like to continue on the topic of our restless neighbors of Russia and Belarus. They're saying that they're always afraid of something, or they're pretended they're afraid of something. Therefore, they make ridiculous, provocative decisions. It's suffice it to remind us of the closing down of the border with Belarus when thousands of Lithuanian trucks could not get back home. Yet another plan by the Lithuanian defense minister. They intend to create a fortification near Suwalki Gap, Suwalki corridor. What do you think is behind this logic, and do they threaten the security of the Union state?
I'm already tired of keeping track of these statements, let alone comment on these statements of the Baltic politicians. There are no grounds to hype on this matter and to blow it out of proportion. By making such claims, these claims backfire, and a natural feeling is happening in Russia or in Belarus that they are up to something. They are up to some kind of a provocation in order to provoke some specific actions on our part, and then to call for the unity of the European Union and the North Atlantic Alliance. And the threats against the Kaliningrad region follows the same path. We would not engage in this exchange of rhetorical threats, but everybody should know that that would be suicidal for those who engage in such kind of provocations. If they're concerned about the Suwalki corridor, I saw a lot of video footage and photos that a great deal of military resources will be released, will be free in Greenland. A lot has been said about Macron, and it would be wrong not to give the floor to RT France. So, this is RT TV channel. I know that there are French journalists here, but they're not quite active. Okay, then you are next. RT France. Igor Kuroshenko, RT France. Thank you for this opportunity to ask a question. Actually, we have two questions. Last year, there have been first contacts between Russia and the Sahel States Confederation. At the same time, the Foreign Ministry noted multiple attempts by Western countries to destabilize the situation in the region. What does it have to do with that? And what is the plan of Russia? How does it intend to further develop relations with the Sahel states? And the second question, if I may. Last year, we've seen an outburst of conflict in the DRC, and despite the mediation by the United States and the signing of peace agreements in Washington, the conflict hasn't been resolved completely. Why do you think these initiatives not lead to peace? What is the key to resolving this crisis, and is Russia ready, given the relevant request, to provide its mediation? By way of answering to the previous question, I have already said, if we are asked for mediation, we do not deny anyone. We have good relations with Congo and Rwanda, and we want to see the conflict between them end, although the prospects for the settlement of this conflict is nowhere within sight. You've mentioned the initiative by Donald Trump, and he listed this conflict among the 8 wars that he ended, but he said that recently that this war has been unleashed once again. There are deep-rooted causes and reasons. Without eliminating them, one simply cannot say that an agreement was reached and everything is okay. There is this M23 movement. It's not quite legitimate, but it is quite strong. There are a lot of other factors, and once again, should there be a request, we will take a look at how we can help. In principle, for many years, we have been resuming our close cooperation with Africa. In 2019 and 2023, we had 2 Russia-Africa summits. We plan to have the 3rd Russia-Africa summit this year. There were 2 ministerial forums. One forum took place in Sochi 2 years ago, and the second one took place in Cairo last year. We are expanding the network of our diplomatic missions. It has been reduced significantly, and it has suffered after the vanishing of the Soviet Union. Due to financial and political concerns, Russia started to pay less attention to the developing world regions, Asia, Africa, Latin America. Last year, we have resumed the work of the embassy in Niger, Sierra Leone, South Sudan, Gambia, Liberia, Togo, the Comoros are next in line, and the general number of our embassies in Africa will reach 49. That means that we'll have embassies in virtually all countries, with small exception. We are resuming the work of our trade missions. They cover 15 African states, which is not enough, but this is the work in progress. You have mentioned the Sahel State Alliance. Over the past 3 years, after the alliance was established, we've been helping actively these states in getting rid of the neo-colonial dependence from former colonial powers, in developing their economy, statehood, defense capabilities. Our experts are working there, both economy experts and military experts. We signed last year an agreement, framework agreements with Mali and Togo. We are establishing intergovernmental bilateral commissions with the states. We have already established this commission with Mali, and we are finalizing the process with Burkina Faso, Niger, and the Central African Republic. And we sign a host of other agreements with them. We see that the French, former hosts of this Sahara-Sahel Troika, try to stand in the way of successful work of the government, of the authorities in this country, and they resort to terrorist means, and they use various terrorist groups and what remains of the Islamic State and other terrorist entities in Africa. Facts are clear. Such kind of activities is carried out involving Ukrainian instructors. Upon the instruction of the Kiev regime, they are ready to hamper the Russian Federation and all our friends in all parts of the globe. Well, thanks God, everything is smooth in their country and they can deal with external expansion. That's what they are doing. But I am sure that the African states clearly understand that such kind of interference into their domestic affairs is nefarious, is bad, and what we see clearly now are good prerequisites for establishing normal win-win relations between the Sahel Alliance and the economic community of Western Africa, ECOWAS, just like between the Sahel states and the African Union. After nationally guided politicians in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali came to power, well, there were some gaps in these relations, and now some efforts are taken in order to resume the normal cooperation, to resume relations. We welcome that, and we are ready to contribute to that. French representatives, we have the press conference for 2.5 hours, three recapping questions. Okay. France, over to you.
Mr. Lavrov, Donald Trump himself said to the Europeans to focus on Ukraine, but is Russia ready to let the Europeans play a role in Ukraine, especially after a possible peace agreement?
Я уже как-то отвечал.
I have already responded to the relevant question. It's not about somebody giving others a chance to play a role. It's about whether you want to do that. That's the first one. And the second question, can you play a role that would lead to a durable peace? I do not see such kind of figures in Europe who are active on the Ukrainian file. I'm talking about Berlin, Paris. I've even forgotten. Oh, Brussels, definitely. Helsinki, the Baltic states, and London, by the way. It is, well, speaking on behalf of the EU, I know that maybe they placed their bid to rejoin the EU, but still there is these 5 figures: Starmer, Macron, Merz. Well, these politicians. And Ursula von der Leyen, naturally, and other leaders in Brussels, I do not see their interest in putting an end to the conflict. Once again, let me reiterate what I've mentioned in this hall some time ago. What they aspire to have is to endorse the Zelensky plan, as they put it, some kind of 20-point plan. And the crux of this plan is that the immediate truce shall be established, and these truce should be accompanied with some legal security guarantees for Ukraine. It begs the question, what would these security guarantees deal with? How it looks like right now? Well, it is the guarantees that the current Nazi regime will be preserved in the part of Ukraine that will be kept and that will be ruled by this regime. At the same time, all this talk about this being the best plan and it should be endorsed, the most important thing is to convince Trump, and then Trump will convince Putin, and they have only one goal in mind: to keep this regime in power. Zelensky has recently claimed it publicly. This regime will never recognize that Crimea, Novorossiya, and Donbass are Russian parts. They will strongly oppose that. Truce throughout the current battlefield line, and then foreign countries will help us. They will build bases, military bases, as was claimed by Starmer and Macron, that they will deploy their boots on the ground in Ukraine. They will build the military hub networks, military bases, that is, and they will continue have a military build-up in this territory, pumping weapons to Ukraine in order to create the security threats to the Russian Federation. So the idea of Trump that was discussed and that was supported by us in Anchorage has been brought to naught by this European group of elites. They do not want to have any final outcome. Zelensky says, well, we'll stop, we'll have security guarantees, we'll sign a plan with Trump on the rebuilding of Ukraine that is worth 800 billion USD, and we'll leave the rest. Well, this is a confession of their genuine intention, and their genuine intention is that they will keep on using military force to create threats to the Russian Federation. As for whether we are willing or not willing to cooperate with Europe, currently there's this new foreign secretary in the UK, They are changing rapidly, and now there is this woman, Cooper. I think her name is Cooper, and she said that London sees the high level of commitment of Ukraine to the peaceful settlement building upon the US plan. They do not say a word about the fact that the US plan was completely twisted as compared to the plan presented in Alaska, and currently it is a plan to preserve the Nazi regime and refusal to recognize realities on the ground. And she said the proof, there is no proof that Moscow intends to seek peace. I know that these British ladies claim and make their stance clear without any hesitation, and hence it begs the question whether there is this place for Europe. Europe in February 2014, and let me give you this journey into history, because no matter how much I talk about that, I still get these questions. In February 2014, after the coup, we told Europeans 2 days prior to the coup, you guaranteed an agreement between then Ukrainian president and the opposition that there would be snapple action, there would be no military actions taken, make the opposition implement these agreements and release the administrative buildings that it occupied. But Berlin, Paris, and Warsaw, in a shy way, told us, you know, sometimes democracy takes curious shapes. And that's it. We asked the Americans, because prior to this truce agreement, the agreement on the settlement between the president and the opposition in February 2014, Obama called Putin and asked him, Vladimir, please do not stand in the way of this agreement. And Putin said, if President Yanukovych is ready to sign it, how can I stand in the way of the legitimate president of a sovereign state? How can I impede him from making a decision? Then we called the Americans. You asked us and we supported it. You cannot stop your proteges who you've been funding. And they avoided answering our question altogether. When the putschist group that came to power stated immediately that they would abandon, that they would cancel the status of the Russian language, that was the first official statement. And the second statement is that they would send fighters to storm the Crimean parliament. And after that, Crimeans rose against these authorities, and they said, would not want to do anything with you. They had a referendum, and the Donbass referendum took place as well. The Kiev regime sent the combat aviation using artillery in violation of all norms of the humanitarian law against its own population. Remember how they bombed Lugansk, the heart of the city. The administrative buildings were bombed by planes. What did Europe say back in the day? Jan Rasmussen, NATO Secretary General, said, we urge the new authorities in Kiev to use power proportionately. And before the coup, when Yanukovych refused to use power against those who occupied the central square, the so-called Maidan, NATO demanded the Ukrainian authorities on a daily basis not to use force against civilians. And they were not allowed to use force. And once the people who came to power, who were sponsored by Victoria Nuland, and she said $5 billion USD were spent to create this group, this group was called to use force proportionately. So in the first time, the Europeans just failed in February 2014 when they refused to live up by the commitments. And the second chance was given in February 2015 when, with the participation of France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia, the Minsk agreements were agreed. And France and Germany always stated that this was an agreement between Moscow and Kiev, and Paris and Berlin are guarantors. We went to the Security Council, which endorsed these agreements, and then it turned out former President Hollande and Chancellor Merkel they recognized 2 years ago that nobody intended to implement these agreements. They simply wanted to buy time to rearm Ukraine. That is exactly that's been publicly stated as an imperative for Ukraine. 2 months 2 months truce, and then we'll see. The main point is to keep the regime in power. That's the second chance. The third chance that Europe got after the beginning of the special military operation, or before the beginning of the special military operation, Europe had a chance to support the initiative by President Putin to reach an agreement on the security guarantees between Russia and the North Atlantic Alliance. And our initiative was rejected. They even refused to discuss it. They said, well, it's not our business what we're doing in NATO and who intends to join NATO. After that, the special military operation was launched following the request of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic that we recognized as independent. So Europe has failed on its chances even then. In April 2022, upon the Ukrainian proposal, the parameters for settlement were negotiated in Istanbul, and Europe did not stand in the way of Boris Johnson, who banned Zelensky from signing these agreements. That's it. I do not know what Europe is intending to do. Does it intend to have a situation when they can keep on deceiving everyone and keeping up with its anti-Russian agenda? Well, why do we need to do that?
The penultimate question, TASS agency, please. Good afternoon, Minister. Madam Zakharova, Ilya Yermakov, TASS News Agency. Today, Russian embassies in countries with unfriendly governments are basically under direct threat. I'm not just talking about the U.S. actions. Consulate generals have been shut down in Poland. There are attacks in Sweden, and there's been talk about seizing land in other countries. What is the toolkit Russia can resort to in order to respond? Will responses always be symmetrical? Well, as far as the decision by the municipality of Copenhagen is concerned, I think this is not a decision or maybe an intention. The announcement we've just heard, they want to seize the land from the embassy of Russia. I think this is somehow, tied to Greenland, because probably they want to use that land to relocate Greenlandic population from there. But basically this is utter rudeness, and we will respond to that with dignity. I don't think that these Danish bureaucrats will be able to create such flagrant precedent, which is going to be impactful on great many other situations. I wanted to say that when responded to one of the previous questions, then I thought better. Right now I'm gonna get back to that thought. I'm gonna quote an important Russian statesman. A long time ago, we could have anticipated that this furious rage, which was getting stronger year in, year out for 30 years, it was inflamed in the West against Russia. It would be unleashed, and right now the moment has come. Basically, enough has been made to Russia to suicide itself, to abandon its very essence, its very core. It's been offered to Russia to recognize that it is just an evil that needs to be rectified. This is Fyodor Tuchev, a Russian diplomat and a Russian poet, and he wrote that in 1854. That was on the eve of the Crimean War, which was unleashed against, back then, the Russian Empire. I was hesitant about resorting to this quote. Some would say this is paranoia, nothing else. They are seeing threats everywhere. But when I was getting ready for today's event and when I was rereading the statements by Europeans, I quoted Macron, who said what he said about Russia. And I read some of those out to you. I quoted Pistorius and Rutte and Stubb. Nothing has changed. Russia's strategic defeat was the goal, which was the goal back then, starting from Napoleon, and then on through to the Crimean War, and on to the intervention by the foreign powers during the First World War, and then the Second World War. So Europe basically is a source of all evils, main evils of humanity, starting from slavery to colonialism to 2 world wars that were unleashed with enormous casualties. And Europe very much clings to this mindset, being unable to change it anyhow. So when reading today's politicians, when looking at the intrigues they are weaving in order to preserve the regime that only answers to them, which is a Nazi regime which practices Nazism and the very same things that got Hitler and his followers to the Nuremberg trials. Well, I'm shocked at that, but right now healthy forces have resurged in Europe, and their voice can be heard not just in Hungary and Slovakia, but also in the Czech Republic and even in Germany and in France. There are forces that care first and foremost about their own national interests rather than some imperial ambitions that had collapsed a long time ago and will never get back. Madam Zakharova, just a moment, please. Colleagues, the last question. You know, very much like to see how the last become the first. Ivan Blagoy. Thank you, Minister. My question is also about Europeans that have missed out on a chance. I'm here. Oh, there you are. Recently, our president has spoken about the possibility of getting back to a discussion on global as well as European architecture. So I would like to ask you how such a discussion is even possible with Europeans and under what conditions. The president has spoken on multiple occasions about this subject. He spoke in this very room in June 2024. He articulated our approach towards the Ukrainian settlement, and he did that in great detail yet another time, and he also presented his vision for a Eurasian architecture of security, and we assume that Eurasian security comprehends security across the whole continent, because it is impossible to divide this single geopolitical and geoeconomic space. But until recently, those who had been promoting the concept of Euro-Atlanticism were precisely in this camp. They wanted to build a NATO with an appendix in the form of the EU and together with the Soviet Union, but that was a different time. They set up the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and once the USSR was gone, this tool was repurposed with a view to eliminating any traces of Russia's influence across this geopolitical space. And recently, both NATO and the EU and the OSCE have been employed in order to infiltrate into the regions that traditionally have been under our influence. I refer to the Caucasus, Central Asia, the Russian Far East. So without agreeing to an equal continental architecture, they wanted to manage everything from a Euro-Atlantic center. That was their purpose. And these ideas are very much alive and relevant, at least for them. And they are trying by any means trying to cling to them. I do not know what's going to happen after the Greenland drama, but this mindset has deep roots in the heads of the current European elites, most of them. Meanwhile, what we are proposing, what are they doing? In Central Asia, they are saying you don't have to do anything with Russia or with China. they're gonna sabotage your development, whereas we will help you with development, with democracy, LGBT, and all other stuff like that. They are trying to dissuade them and other countries like Mongolia from cooperation with Russia or with China in the Far East as well. They are trying to build their own rules of the game, in particular through trying to incorporate some elements of Euro-Atlantic structures there. A case in point, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines. They're also trying to sabotage the unity of ASEAN. So rather than pursuing a continental equal architecture, which is something we're in favor of, an architecture where everyone's interest is going to be well balanced, they want to manage this biggest, richest continent from one Euro-Atlantic center. At least that was that is what their plan was until recently. Right now, the EU and NATO are in a deep crisis. The OSCE is nigh to its last breath. And I think all these attempts are destined to fail. Those who are more far-sighted, more perspicacious, let them join our efforts, ours and Belarusians' efforts, when we're trying to promote our Charter for Eurasian Security. There's the Minsk conference, which right now is attended by a number of European ministers and representatives. This number is only going to grow. Colleagues, this marks the end of our annual press conference. Thank you for participating and all the best. Thank you.